When, O supreme amongst humans, you were born on this earth, you paced out 7 strides, then said, I am supreme in this world. To you who were wise then, I prostrate. With pure bodies, form supremely pure, wisdom ocean like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not. Incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior, having great compassion, the Founder, having all understanding, the field of merit with qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. The purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, the one path, the sublime pure reality, to the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts. To you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Then the short mandala offering, that's on either 97 or 98, depending on the version of the prayer book you have. As usual, we'll follow that with refuge and bodhicitta, once in English, twice in the Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki chok nam la, jang chu bardu dak ni kyab su chi, daki chunyan gi peso nam gi, dola penchir sangye drupar sho. Sangye chodang soki chok nam la, jang chu bardu dak ni kyab su chi, Daki chunyan gi peso nam gi, drola penchir sangye drupar sho. Okay, let's do a little meditation before we begin. Take an opportunity to focus the mind a bit, to let go of our distractions by using the breath as a meditation object. Again, use whatever technique is suitable to your mind to work with the breath. But again, the importance is placed on trying to maintain your awareness of the breath as best as you can, but then also to be vigilant so that you see when the mind has wandered away and then correct that by bringing the mind back to the breath. Then after a few minutes in silence on the breath, I'll lead you in a short reflection to set motivation. Now, to set our motivation in this final class on minds and mental factors, I thought it would be useful to reflect briefly on something that came up in Monday's class or lunchtime class on patience and overcoming anger. That's this idea that no matter how prominent these delusions like anger and attachment, jealousy, pride, and so on, no matter how prominent they might be in our minds, they're not inherent to the mind. They're not the true nature of our minds. Our minds are pure, clear. These delusions arise due to various causes and conditions, and they fall away at times and reappear just like clouds in the sky. But they don't taint the sky-like nature of the mind. The mind has that fundamental purity, and it's within that idea that we are examining this idea of antidoting these various delusions, having ways to offset them in a temporal way, as well as what we're going to begin with tonight, a more ultimate way to eventually be free of them. It's because of their transitory nature, because of the fact that they are not inherent to the mind, that they can be removed. So as we set our motivation tonight, try to bring that understanding into developing bodhicitta. That all of what we're talking about accomplishing on the path, completely reducing and eventually destroying these delusions, as well as completely developing, cultivating the positive qualities, all of this can be done within the sphere of the nature of the mind. It's because the mind is fundamentally pure that all of that can occur. If anger were inherent to the mind or any of the delusions, then we could never remove them. We could never achieve the state of liberation or enlightenment. So as you set that motivation of bodhicitta, have that understanding that it is completely possible then for you to attain that state, for you to remove all the obstructions in the mind, the afflictive obstructions and even the subtle knowledge obstructions that keep you from becoming a Buddha. And then you can dedicate your life completely to helping others to do the same work, because they too have that pure mind, have that Buddha nature. So within the context of the purity of the mind, bodhicitta makes absolute sense. There's nothing stopping both ourselves and all beings from attaining enlightenment. As long as we apply the path, as long as we do the work, we can accomplish that goal. And it always begins with setting that intention, as we're doing right now, thinking that we're here in order to accomplish complete enlightenment for ourselves and all sentient beings. Okay. So we are working our way through the final part of this text where there's a summary. And in the last class, I sort of left off at a point where I went into a little side discussion of the antidotes to the afflictions. I was on page 90 towards the bottom. And there was a little quote from Puchungpa who said, "Even when I am quashed by the afflictions from beneath, I grit my teeth." And the idea was here is just learning how to be able to address these afflictions when they arise. And so far we talked about 3 different techniques. Let me go ahead and go to the slideshow, share that with the folks who are online. And so the 3 lines of defense that I've sort of set out, which again, this is not absolute, this doesn't come from some teaching of the Buddha or something, all these things are talked about, but nonetheless, the normal one is to talk about both temporal and ultimate antidotes. But I always speak to the first line of defense being avoidance. If we can physically or mentally avoid the object that is triggering that particular delusion, be like a log mentally, not, if we're attentive to what's going on in the mind, sometimes we can stop that process without even having to put an antidote in place. But nonetheless, that's only a first line of defense. Eventually, we do need to apply the temporal antidotes, and I'll go through those in a moment. There were a couple that I categorized. some which are quite specific to that individual delusion. And the third line in defense we'll talk about tonight in brief at the beginning, undermining through the ultimate antidote, the wisdom realizing emptiness. So the first line of defense, avoidance, physically remove oneself from the object, mentally distance oneself through observation of the process and not reacting, to be like a log. Again, some wonderful teachings from Venerable Pema Chodron in her book, Taking the Leap, where she talks about kind of a teaching she got from one of her teachers, I think it's Dzigar Kongtrul Rinpoche, who told her that there's this kind of, they call it Shenpa in Tibetan. It's sort of a way that we get hooked by objects. And if you're really attentive and you can kind of see how it's happening right at that microscopic level, when that object is appearing in your field of awareness and you're getting hooked. Whether it's, I'm not talking about hooked in a desirous way, it can be hooked in a negative way, like you're hooked by it, but you want to be removed from it. It gets you. There's something sticky about the object almost. It kind of immediately adheres to your mind. So if you're really aware at that point, you can sometimes pull back and just recognize what's going on, and you don't have to apply an antidote. But we get stuck pretty seriously on some stuff, so that may be where we need these heavier antidotes, second and third line of defense. Second line of defense, as I went through last time, for almost all the delusions, it seems that you can recall impermanence to some degree. Impermanence is often set out as one of them dealing with attachment, but even with anger, the object of our anger isn't permanent, unchanging. It will change over time. The situation will change over time. Every incident that we've had with another being or a situation where we got angry has come to an end. Fortunately, it didn't last forever. We might still have memories of it or still be plagued by it occasionally, but the individual experience has come to an end. It is impermanent. It changes. And then, of course, the disadvantages of these negative states of mind. This is also a way that we can kind of apply an antidote at that time if we're aware that our anger is only going to exacerbate our suffering. It's not going to solve the situation. It could inflame it, in fact, and make it even more dangerous. We might engage in greater verbal or physical actions on the basis of that. And then we go to attachment. We can see the disadvantages of attachment. Again, all of these delusions have disadvantages. So that can be a way to frame it so that we kind of don't go there. As I said, I've used this analogy before, and I think it's really true. If you are, say you're diagnosed with something where you have to avoid particular foods, well then when you're in the presence of that food, as much as you might want to eat it, you're recalling the disadvantage of eating that, and the basis of the condition will be more unfavorable for you if you do engage in eating that food. So we know that this works to some degree even in our mundane habits. So it can certainly work in regard to the delusions as long as we have the strength of mind to know the disadvantages at that time and be mindful of them. And then the specific antidotes that counter that particular affliction, we went into that last time. For example, for attachment, they say it's often to look at the undesirable features of that object, because when the mind of attachment is operative, we're only seeing what is pleasant and we're exaggerating that. So if we look at the undesirable qualities of that object, we will bring ourselves down to a more balanced view. Not that we go to the degree of hating that person or object, but we need to see it more clearly. And then, of course, with anger, a specific antidote for anger would be, especially if it's anger or hatred towards a person, would be loving kindness, compassion for them. There are lots of antidotes that we talked about in the class on anger that we were doing on Mondays. So again, each of these are specific because they don't counter all the delusions across the board, whereas the first two, to some degree could be applied. The understanding might be a little bit different in regard to each of them, but nonetheless, there's a way to apply those to almost every delusion, whereas the specific antidote is just for that unique delusion. So any comments on those before we go on to the final line of defense, which is really where we ultimately want to be, is with that antidote of the wisdom of emptiness. So I've just put this on the slide here as recalling the emptiness of the three spheres, which is often what they talk about. The agent, which is you yourself, who are acting in regard to what's going on or having the delusion arise in your own mind. The object that is triggering that, which can be a person, a physical object, a noise, whatever the case might be. And then the action itself, whatever is going on in relation to that. But this includes then everything involved. And of course, you have to have some strength of understanding of emptiness to be able to apply this. So I think most of us are developing our wisdom along that continuum to where we can get to a point where we can feel a sort of selflessness in the midst of what's going on, to feel like the target that's being hit by that person or that object, whatever it is that they are, that's going on in that situation, we can see that there's no real target there, that what we're setting up the target through our fictitious adherence to this self, this I that is non-existent. So if we see it as fictitious at that time, we see that this target that we're setting up doesn't really exist, then there's nothing to be hit. There's nothing going on. And the object itself doesn't have any inherent existence. And the action that we're engaged in doesn't have any inherent existence. So it is hard to get to that point in my estimation, but nonetheless, it's based on, again, on the strength of your meditation on emptiness. And of course, the accuracy in determining what emptiness is. There's a lot of different, as we know from those of you who've taken the Tenets course and studied the different views of emptiness, there are a lot of different ways it's set out, to begin to undermine that strong adherence to a self that is the final one that we have to overcome. There are steps that we can take along the way. One of them, for example, in the Chittamatra, the mind-only school, is to see that although it isn't in line with reality, it's an interesting way to observe reality, that what appears to be external actually isn't external. It's arising from the force of the karmic seed or bakchak, an imprint on our minds that gives rise to the mind that is knowing it, the object that is appearing, and then that's all a karmic occurrence that is not really grounded in a physical reality outside of ourselves, kind of like a dream. When we're dreaming, we have that same type of experience, right? We think that there's an elephant in the room or whatever's going on, but there's nothing really there. There's no physical basis for it. It's arising on the basis of a firing of an imprint in our minds that causes this false appearance. So in the Chittamatra view, they say that this is actually a really good tool to help undermine our attachment to a lot of objects in the physical world. If we think that they're just a karmic arising kind of in the state of a dream, well, then we don't get so attached to them because we don't see them as being quite so real. But nonetheless, again, Tsongkhapa goes to great lengths in some of his later texts to disprove this view of emptiness, but it's a helpful tool for some people. It was taught in some of the sutras of the Buddha, and Sangha elaborated on it, they said, for the benefit of his brother Vasubandhu, but nonetheless, there are different views of emptiness. It should be examined and reflected upon to get to that final view. But if we begin to undermine it through especially the understanding of dependent arising, which I won't go into great lengths on all of this, but dependent arising is said to be the ideal way to realize emptiness. We talked about this a little bit back in the views, right? When we talked about the extreme views of annihilation and permanence or existence, that we need to find a middle way that goes between those. And the method of realizing dependent arising, or realizing emptiness through dependent arising, is said to be very effective. So I don't want to talk, that much more about emptiness unless people want me to talk about emptiness. It's obviously a huge topic, but it is the ultimate antidote. As we're going to see when we continue back in the text, this is the way that we are able to remove the delusions completely. And we went through, again, a brief examination of the path, the 5 paths that the Bodhisattva is on. In the first path, you're accumulating your merit and wisdom so that you can eventually have a correct view of emptiness united with your calm abiding and special insight together. And it's still conceptual at that point, but it allows you to then enter the path of preparation. In the path of preparation, through the 4 levels of that, you continue to refine your view of emptiness, and it becomes less and less of a feeling of a subject and an object. The duality seems to be kind of diminishing over those 4 stages till you get to the last one, which again is called supreme mundane quality, because those are the greatest qualities that you have as a mundane being before you've developed a super mundane wisdom. When you get to that point, this is just prior to entering into that meditative equipoise where you realize emptiness directly for the first time, you enter into that, and the sense of subject and object completely disappears. And then you're realizing emptiness as it is, with no conceptual overlay, coming to merge your mind with that emptiness, so that you then come out of that having begun the process of removing your afflictive obstructions. The Bodhisattva at that point has removed just the innate afflictive or the acquired afflictive obstructions, which are those that are acquired through false tenets and what have you, false philosophical teachings. And then you go on to remove the innate. And you remove all those through the 7th ground. When you enter the 8th ground, you are on the pure grounds because you no longer have the afflictive obstructions. You're comparable to a foe destroyer, somebody who has accomplished the Hinayana path. Then you go on the 8th, 9th, and 10th grounds to remove the knowledge obscurations, obscurations to omniscience, which are, once more, the imprints that have been left by virtue of having had that ignorance for so long that cause this dualistic appearance. When you're off the cushion, when you're not realizing emptiness directly, there's always this kind of false appearance that things exist independently, inherently, on their own. So even though bodhisattvas have no conviction in that appearance whatsoever, it continues to plague them, and it's an obstacle to having an omniscient mind. Once you remove those imprints on the 3 pure grounds, you enter into the path of no more learning. So again, it's after the path of preparation, it's the path of seeing, which is mostly your initial direct realization into emptiness until you begin the process of your second direct realization into emptiness. That starts the path of meditation, and then you continue doing that until you remove everything. So the pure grounds are part of the path of meditation. So again, I don't know if I need to say too much more, but I'm sure Geshe-la will get into some teachings on emptiness while he's here as well. There's some teachings on emptiness in the 37 practices of a bodhisattva, which is, I think, the text he's going to be teaching on Sunday. So I don't think you'll get it to that in the middle-length Lam Rim yet, because he's not quite that far in the Lam Rim teachings. But anyway, you get his teachings on that as well. So any questions on emptiness and this ultimate antidote? Yeah, in my estimation, it is kind of hard to get there, because you really do have to get to the very, very subtle way that the self exists, so that you're not adhering to any inherent self or independently existing self. I don't know. Do you want to speak, Rowena?
No, we were just reading Vajrapāṇi.
Oh, okay. You did a recitation of that. Yeah, yeah. The Vajrapāṇi Sutra is kind of interesting, because it really just puts it out there in almost like a completely negating way. If any bodhisattva adheres to this at all, if they think there's this at all, then they're mistaken, kind of thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Important ways that things are labeled.
Yeah.
So this is sort of a menu
True.
to examine how you label things. But my understanding of it is the heart.
Yeah. Yeah. No sentient beings whatsoever have been liberated. Only those, like the ideas. Yeah, they're just called sentient beings. They're just, that's why they're called sentient beings. There's nothing beyond being called that. Being labeled that. So.
I wonder, Donald, when I'm reading it, that is because the action of our mind is designating things, and it's just Buddha's just simply saying, okay, quit designating things. You're going to be moving in the right direction. I mean.
Well, Rowena was asking, is it because the Buddha is saying that it's the action of our minds to designate things and to
build that, because that's the ground for building on.
Yeah, but the designation. I mean, I don't want to say the designation is the problem, because that's just the mere establishment of phenomena through the force of our designation. But and we go immediately beyond that. We immediately layer stuff on top of it. But that's also because, once more, recall that it also appears to inherently exist once we have given it that label. Once we call something a particular term, then that term merges with the object, in a sense, and appears back to us as if it's self-established. So we buy into it really easily because it's appearing that way too. If it didn't appear that way, I think we'd have a harder time buying into it, perhaps. But so it's a kind of a dual thing going on.
So different for every person.
Well, is the way they appear different to every person?
Okay, my perception here is loss of a child. This has been
right. I understand.
And just thinking of the depth of the incredibly hard to change connections. There's no name for that.
Mm-hmm.
So the Buddha's saying, a lot of what he's saying is, well, don't get hung up calling yourself a bodhisattva, because if you use the label, that's not, a bodhisattva. But you can be a bodhisattva. He's not saying he's never a bodhisattva. In this case, way down on the ground level here, where I am, trying to, there's some difficulties, because I'm not just dealing with mental labels. It's this whole thing, like you're saying, you get involved with the object in such a way that it's really hard to separate from it.
So Rowena is speaking, for those online, Rowena is speaking to just this experience she's having around that there's stuff that isn't really involved in the labeling, but is a way of getting at things that is felt more than it is, a cognitive experience, perhaps, and yeah. But but I mean, I think at some level that's still a form of labeling, no matter what, because it's some form of a conceptual designation, even if we haven't given it terms, even if we haven't, established language for it. Because it's not just language that's involved in all of this, though obviously it's mostly what we deal with as we learn language and operate in the world and what have you. Yeah, Bob.
Yeah, it's not like labels. I mean, what I actually like to do is projection.
Yeah,
I feel like what we do is we project things onto the world, and then we believe the world is those projections.
yeah, yeah. So Bob was just proposing, yeah, projections would be one way to talk about it. Yeah, I mean, I guess projection is okay, but the thing is that I often use projection to refer to the stuff that we're putting on top of it that isn't there. And so when we're talking about just the label or the designation or the imputation or whatever word we want to use, that's the bottom line. That's how things exist, and it can be outside of language. It is something that we are projecting, but projections I often think of as like the stuff we're putting on top, the projection of an inherently existent I, whereas I, the mere I, is simply labeled, is simply designated, simply. And that's the way that things all exist. It's just through the force of that designation, that conceptual imputation. So, but yeah, Amy.
I think for me, having a merely imputed person grow inside of me for 9 months, I don't know. Is that a projection or a superimposition or a label? I mean, I think maybe what Rowena is talking about there, like losing a child. I'm sure it's horribly awful for men as well who don't carry children inside of them. But I can't conceive of that. Like I think that must be the worst inside. I don't know how does one separate oneself from that on this relative level. I mean, I can't even explain what that is, but it's
So
person,
yeah.
merely imputed.
So in this idea of dealing with the loss of a child, which is how this sort of started with Alex dealing with that, and Rowena has dealt with that previously and earlier in this life. So there's Mamie was just saying that, yeah, for a mother in particular to go through that, and it is a bit indescribable then at that level. I mean, what you're going through, it's hard to put in any kind of language. It's quite an intense loss, as you're saying, Amy.
Color everything.
Sure.
In a different way than I can intellectually engage in discussing.
Okay.
And I'm just, I don't know. I'm just wondering because there's a level where we approach things intellectually. I'm very much into that, and yet there's levels of feeling and projections of existence on things. Even though you're not using words, you're not using electrical things. You have some of these other sort of kinds of grasping reifications of what you're working with.
Okay. So I'm trying to keep track of what you're saying to be able to put it into words for the folks online. But I'm not so sure I'm going to be. But again, you were just talking to the fact that some of it doesn't have to do with the identification through a process of labeling, but rather, again, of what we might call a felt experience or something that is.
But it's still a reification.
There's still a reification. Sure. Yeah, I mean, because at some level, once more, we are adhering to everything as if it's real. In the way that Rinpoche talks about it, again, reality being a superimposition, an overlay on top of what does exist, which is mere imputation. We're not relating to things as if they're merely imputed, whether we talk about a being that we've lost or the loss itself or the grief or whatever it is that's going on with us. We're referring to it in our own conceptuality as if it were real. Really real, inherently there. There's no denying it's an experience, and at the level of mere imputation, that's all that there is. But, I don't know. Anyway, this is, so again, the teachings on emptiness, they get to be hard to apply in some particular cases, but we do need to continue to work with it as much as possible when we're encountering something in our lives, to sort of pick it apart and say, well, what is really here? How does this really exist?
But in remembrance of impermanence is the one thing that bails you out of
Yeah.
the real bucket of this
Yeah.
sense of emotion and impermanence.
Right. Yeah. So Rowena was saying remembrance of impermanence is what kind of bails you out of it. True. And realization of impermanence, and especially subtle impermanence, is a stepping stone to realizing emptiness, because if things were inherently existing, they would be unchanging. So being a teenager forever. um, that sounds like hell. Anyway, Amy said being pregnant forever, and I said being a teenager forever. I can't relate to being pregnant.
Being the mom of a teenager forever.
Steve said being the mom of a teenager. Yeah. So let's go back to the text and kind of resume our going through this final section. There are a few sections where I would like to talk a little bit more. I'm not going to just go through these remaining 4 pages, three and a half pages, because there are a few topics in here that I think are worth exploring a little bit further. At the bottom of page 90, we have another wonderful quote from Tsongkhapa from the Lamrim Chenmo. He says, "Although you may get rid of an ordinary enemy temporarily, when he has regained his strength by retiring to another country, he will retaliate. However, afflictions are different. If you are able to get rid of afflictions from their root, then, lacking another place to go, they will not make a comeback. Nonetheless, since we make no effort to destroy the afflictions, they recur." So this is where they always point to the fact that even if you go into these deep concentrations that we've touched on, the 4 form realm concentrations, the 4 formless absorptions, and you develop a very subtle mind that is no longer manifesting these delusions. It doesn't seem like they're there because there's nothing in the mental makeup for them to be triggered. But that still hasn't gotten rid of them. Until you develop the supramundane path, the wisdom realizing emptiness directly, you will not have uprooted them. And again, it's a process of uprooting, as I explained earlier. It's not that you go into that one time and then that's it. You've gotten rid of all of them. You have to first get the innate, and then you go into different levels of the delusions to break away the coarser levels first and finally get to the subtler ones, and then eventually you can destroy them to the point where they won't recur. There's no longer anything that will act as a part of the process. Remember when I went through all these different causes of the delusions for arising, we talked about the first 3 being the most important, in terms of the basis, which is the seed, which is totally destroyed by the wisdom realizing emptiness, or made completely impotent, if you will. I don't know what happens to them. They're just imprints in the mind, or seeds in the mind. So we're not talking about something physical. But nonetheless, that is made totally impotent, incapable of producing the results of the delusions by virtue of your wisdom realizing emptiness through the first 7 grounds. When you finally enter the 8th ground, you no longer have that, present. But even in regard to the 3rd one, which is the inappropriate attention, the ways that we're using our thinking process to create more delusion, that would already be dismantled once you have, probably even prior to a direct realization of emptiness. But when you come out of meditative equipoise, again, you're not buying into how things appear at all. So you're not going to be overlaying with all kinds of stuff. You're not going to be causing the delusions to arise because you don't believe in what's appearing to you at all. There's no conviction in it. You don't inherently exist, and the object doesn't inherently exist, and the action itself doesn't inherently exist. None of this is, a mistake that you would make at that point. So you don't really have these erroneous, misconceptions, or erroneous conceptions, misconceptions. So again, this is just Tsongkhapa reiterating that we have to put effort into eventually uprooting these afflictions, which means we have to realize emptiness. So he says, just as it has been said above, when we come under the influence of an affliction, this is the top of page 91, we do not know which affliction it is, and even if we do know, due to our feeble effort and antidote, they recur. So that's why we looked at all this and why we spent time going through the afflictions probably more than any other set of the mental factors, is because we need to really be able to recognize them when they're coming up, because some of them may seem like they're actually a friend of ours, and it's like, no, you're not my friend, sorry. You're actually the enemy. And then you have to make some effort to antidote them, to actually do something different at that time that doesn't allow them to arise. So then it says, however, if we were to generate the power of the antidote, we will definitely be able to abandon them. And by this, they mean, in particular, the ultimate antidote. The foremost omniscient Tsongkhapa again says in the Lamrim Chenmo, having recognized the afflictions, contemplate their drawbacks and the benefits of being separated from them, and then plant the spies of mindfulness and introspection. And we've talked about mindfulness quite a bit. It was one of the omnipresent mental factors. And so we know that that is there, that is it? No, not omnipresent. Object determining. Sorry, I got the wrong category. Object determining mental factors or object ascertaining mental factors. And so if we have mindfulness present, mindfulness means that we are attentive to the object. We are not forgetting it. And of course, here we want a mindfulness that is really paying attention to what's going on, that isn't getting lost in the same habitual patterns of the delusions arising. And then the introspection. Introspection, again, was not on our list of 51, but it's often talked about as kind of an aspect of wisdom. It's the spy in the corner of our mind that kind of checks up to see what's going on and make sure that our mind is staying true to how we want to abide in that moment so that the delusion isn't arising. So we need these two. These are, very important in our development of meditation, but they're also important in terms of our day-to-day tending to the afflictions and making sure that we apply antidotes appropriately. So then he says, Tsongkhapa continues, says, whenever any affliction sprouts forth, again and again you must nip it in the bud. I didn't realize nip it in the bud went back that far as a phrase. But anyway, further, as soon as any affliction stirs in your continuum, you must regard it as an enemy and combat it. Otherwise, if it were to emerge first and you acquiesce and foster it with improper attention, then without any resistance, you will only succumb to it. So this is a pretty tall order, to be that vigilant in our own minds, but nonetheless, this is what we're aiming for. And recall that on the path, in terms of the 3 levels, the main focus at the first level is to be really attentive to what we're doing in our speech and our physical actions. It's not to say that we don't look at the mind, but that's not the main focus. The main focus is to really just stop engaging in a lot of unhealthy patterns that keep us bound in the lower rebirths and continuing to not have good existences. But then when we get to the middle scope is where we do the deeper work on our minds and really begin to address it. So for most of us, we may be quite happy just to be at least curtailing any of the negative actions of body and speech. But eventually we do have to work on our minds. And I recall that little phrase that we recited at the beginning of class. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. That's the 3rd step, So we have to be aware that that's the work we eventually need to do. We may not feel we have the strength of mind to do it yet, but through meditation, through continued practice, we can do this. Every enlightened being was just like us at one point in their development, dealing with crazy minds and trying to combat all of this, and they eventually were able to accomplish it. So Tsongkhapa is just giving us some good advice there about, not acquiescing to the afflictions, because once we do that, then all of these patterns arise. All the causes that I went through will be in place, and the delusion is bound to arise then. Because that's the law of cause and effect. Once all the conditions and causes are there, well, then the effect is going to arise. Can't do much to stop it at that point. So if we are attentive to what's going on, we can stop the causes before they manifest in that effect. Then there's some two verses from chapter 4 of Engaging in the Bodhisattva Deeds. Let's recite these 2 together. Even when an ordinary enemy is banished from a country, he settles in another and takes control. Then, upon recovering strength, he makes a comeback. However, the manner of the enemy afflictions is unlike this. Miserable afflictions are abandoned by the eye of wisdom. Once they are dispelled from my mind, where will they go? Where will they abide until they can return to torment me? It is just that I have been feeble-minded and lack effort. So the promise is there that we can be rid of these once and for all. If we are able to supplant them through realizing emptiness directly, then there won't be any ground for them to arise in our minds whatsoever. It's just that we haven't done the work yet. We've been feeble-minded and lacking the effort that really needs to be involved in this. That's why you can see that, again, going back to, and we're going to mention, he does mention the Lam Rim and the importance of continuing to have a practice that is grounded in all of the teachings of the Lam Rim. We see the importance of having renunciation and these lower realizations that contribute to the whole path to enlightenment, because if we haven't really gotten that for ourselves and understood the danger of these afflictions, we're just going to continue to create the causes for them. So, yeah, I think it is an important realization. I think we had a discussion up in Taos, was it? somebody was saying, what do you think is the hardest realization to get? And I said, oh, I don't know. They say wisdom realizing emptiness, but nonetheless, there's a lot of hard realizations out there. They're all kind of hard to get in some level. And somebody said, I think it's renunciation for me. And I think renunciation is kind of true. It is a really hard one to get to, where we keep getting sucked back into samsara, thinking it's really not so bad, or whatever, and kind of keep doing the same thing. We don't really get that this is like a torture chamber. So get it. We all have to get it. I'm saying that for myself too. I think we all have to get to that place where we really are totally disenchanted, disillusioned with this. Then I think that effort follows. I think renunciation is really, it's said to be the entryway to the path, simply because you need to have that level of distaste for what we're engaged in to really be dedicated to your practice. Before that, I think it's there and it's good and it's important, don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's not strong enough. It's a bit feeble-minded, lacking a bit of effort behind it. So this is where I think it's really important that we take to heart the Lam Rim and really do our meditation on that and have a grounded practice with that, so that we can develop those other realizations that support all of this. If we're ever going to be dedicated to the welfare of all beings, we have to have that. So any comments up to this point? Yeah, Bill.
Maybe it's not linear, but
Uh-huh.
the three principal aspects he puts renunciation before.
Yeah.
With-
Yeah. So
almost like it's a
absolutely.
combo, but maybe it's not.
No, I think it's presented in a sequential way. Bill was just pointing out, on the three principal aspects of the path, we start with renunciation, and then it's bodhicitta, and then it's the wisdom realizing emptiness. And it's not to say that we can't cultivate some understanding of the two higher ones before we get the lower one, but you're not going to have bodhicitta without renunciation. And I don't know that you'd really have the force of mind behind full realization of emptiness unless you have some renunciation as well. You can have some understanding of it, but I think to get to that place where you directly realize it, certainly, I don't know. So I think it's really important that we take that to heart and work on renunciation. We might, keep it in the context of bodhicitta. Why are we developing renunciation? So we can become a Buddha for the sake of all beings. But really focus on those, the small scope and the middle scope, to make sure that we get it. And we have that foundation. Yeah, Tony.
But does renunciation have to relate to samsara being miserable, totally undesirable, even hellish, etc.? Why couldn't renunciation simply be the understanding that what I'm still, what I'm experiencing is truly not real and moves beyond it?
Well, okay, so Tony's question was, does renunciation have to relate to the idea of it being totally distasteful, that we're turning away from samsara with that kind of revulsion towards it? Or can it be driven by an understanding that what we are experiencing isn't real, in other words, informed by our emptiness, our wisdom of emptiness? But I guess, again, if we have to have an understanding that that's problematic, that we aren't seeing things real. So...
But take something that isn't exactly present and to focus on and to make it solid and concrete.
Yeah.
I'm not exactly sure.
No. Yeah. No, I don't think that's the right way to look at it either than what you're saying. I agree with you. Tony was just saying, to kind of focus on the negative of all that and kind of make it real in a way that it isn't either. It would obviously not. That's why, again, ideally we want to practice all three principal aspects together. And renunciation is taught again at the level of the middle scope, where we are applying the wisdom teachings. But on a conventional level, this is where, a lot of people say, and I know even in the Zen tradition, there's this whole thing of samsara is nirvana, nirvana is samsara. Well, in terms of its emptiness, absolutely, there's no difference, because the experience of what we call nirvana or samsara is totally dictated by what's going on in our minds. But nonetheless, they are two different states. Thank you very much. I'll take nirvana, But nirvana isn't inherently existent either. Again, it's a dependent arising, and that it's empty of inherent existence. So again, any reification of anything on our path, and that's where there is, admittedly, from the beginning, when you look at the small scope, there tends to be still a bit of a reification of the self, because we haven't gotten to the selflessness teachings yet. It's like you worry about yourself experiencing these future rebirths that are unfavorable and so on. And even when you get to the middle scope, there's a bit of that in terms of thinking about, the continued existence, not just the lower rebirths, but, the continued existence in samsara. But once you apply the emptiness teachings, of course, there's no real self that's going through any of this. But yet conventionally, there still is a self that does, So conventionally, we always would say there's a benefit to looking at these things more accurately. But the ultimate level is emptiness. Yeah, exactly.
Understanding that it's an illusion, I
Yeah.
think, is precisely enough. And that's
Well, and if it works for you, Tony, to have that recognition of it as an illusion or as the reification that's going on that is false, that's great. Again, I think it needs to be fed too with just a bit of the understanding that, and it's an undesirable state to be in, and we need to move in the opposite direction.
what that allows you to do is to understand
Oh.
how huge a role I played in making it.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
that's all.
Yeah. So Tony was saying it helps him understand how huge a role that he himself, we ourselves, are playing in making that. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and that's why, again, and for all those in the individual vehicle, as well as the first part of the Mahayana, we're dealing with that reality that we have to see that for ourselves. We are the creator of our own samsara. We are the creator of our own nirvana. It just depends on what we do. So, any other comments before we move on? Do you want to say something?
Well, I sort of want to add what Tony's saying in this way, but it's the horrible things, which we have so many at the moment. I mean, to choose from. We have plenty of, ISIS and fire and stuff. I can understand that makes samsara not where I want to be. But I get tripwired because, like, I went out yesterday morning and things were a little bit green. When I come home, the whole yard has burst into green. And I'm delighted, and how in 6 hours can this whole thing just blow up into springtime? And this is, there's this great deal of joy. And because of, I guess, my puritanical background, I start coming down on, oh, well, what are you exaggerating for? And I'm misapplying to some degree the idea of initiation. And I think that's where I get into a trip. I start saying, wait a minute, I shouldn't exaggerate the beauty or whatever. I think there's a point at which you just let it go, realizing it's not going to last anyway.
Right.
We have so much of a tendency to suffer just almost for the sake of suffering sometimes.
Yeah. Rowena was sharing, the idea that it's a bit easy to turn away from the hellish parts of existence, but then when you get to the more beautiful parts, like your experience yesterday of seeing all the green come up based on the rain we had and what have you, and the pleasurable things, the beautiful things of samsara, that maybe it's not quite as easy. But my teacher actually said that those are the things that we need to turn away from. The pleasures of samsara are the seductive parts of it. They kind of pull us back in and go, oh, this is great. Life is good. It's beautiful, wonderful, delightful, delicious. And it isn't. I mean, it's not to say that we still can identify those things as pleasure or as beauty. That still exists. But you are right. We're embellishing it. We're kind of overlaying a lot of stuff. But don't get too puritanical either and feel like we then have to not look, don't look, but then try to use it as an exercise to see to what degree am I embellishing this? To what degree am I simply able to experience the pleasure and not have the attachment or the overlay of all this, to recognize, as you said, that it changes, that it's not going to be the same,
Well, that's what I meant when I said it was exactly what Tony said, about you have to get in charge of it.
Yeah.
In some way. If you're not in charge of how you're reacting to it, or at least succinctly observing, whether you're going to push it one way or the other, if your clarity of observation itself actually can help you let go.
Yeah.
Have some room.
So Rowena was saying, your clarity of observation can help you to let go or have some room. Absolutely. And again, and then you get to tantric practices, which we haven't touched on much in this course, but then you can work with all these things that are pleasurable and kind of the desire to have that manifest for all beings in terms of a tantric pure land and your own enlightenment and and you transform that energy. So I think there's a lot of really nice things that we can do with whatever we're meeting in samsara, but we have to see it for what it is, as Tony was saying. You know, this is a projection of our own minds. It's not something that we can rely upon in the end. We have to purify our own minds.
Well, that's one of the things that bothers me, because I can see things as beautiful. Absolutely no way of explaining people. Because it's my projection. It's what I see. I mean, what I see as beautiful may not appeal to anybody else.
Yeah.
You know, so
Rowena is just, yeah.
So it's just a tendency to exaggerate that I try to express. And you have to really keep on top of yourself. Just, even with humor.
Yeah.
You have to just, you know, too weird about it.
So Rowena was just saying that it's hard sometimes to even, like, things that you might find beautiful that other people wouldn't necessarily, because it's just an experience you have with regard to that thing.
Well, I wonder
Yeah.
why, you know, because some people just dwell on being unhappy.
Yeah.
When there's lots of things to look at.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah, so if there are people, who are dwelling on things that are, causing them to be unhappy, depressed, what have you, sad. Because I don't think that we're talking about developing a sadness in the mind with renunciation either. I mean, these are important things to be open to, the reality that we do have both experiences in this human life in particular. They say that's one of the things that makes it an ideal existence, is that you have a measure of pleasure and pain in this human life generally, though many people have an excess of one or the other, but you can kind of see both sides of it. Even though those are not, again, the real in the way that they're appearing, they nonetheless point to the reality that we have in terms of our conditioned existence, and to be able to discern that we want to move away from suffering, and also even move away from the transitory happiness or pleasure that we experience to something that is much more reliable. So anyway, let's go back to our text and continue on, so we make sure we can conclude this text tonight. Sure.
This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a vision, a adoration, a flame, a light, a illusion, a drop of dew, or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a flash. The all conditioned things.
Yeah. So Tony was just sharing that wonderful verse that we recited earlier from the Diamond Cutter Sutra, Vajracutter Sutra. That's about like a star and so on. So yeah, I mean, these are, wonderful ways again that we have to see that what we're dealing with is illusory in some capacity. It's a hallucination, as Rinpoche would say. So let's go on to this wonderful little line from the Virtuous Spiritual Guide, Gompawa. He says, "What else is there to do besides watching over one's mind day and night?" So really, I mean, what else is there to do? if we're really, yeah, that should be all we're doing. But we get caught up in a lot of other stuff. So this is really beautiful advice. This is really what we're talking about here. There's a wonderful saying from Geshe Ben Kongyal, who I've mentioned a few times before, a wonderful Kadampa Geshe, who said, "Standing at the door of the afflictions, holding the spear of the antidotes, other than this, I have no other job." So it's like, that's it. You're just standing there waiting for the afflictions to arise, and then to spear them when with the antidotes when they're there. So this idea that this is really our job. This is our 24/7 job, is just to really be vigilant and looking at our own minds and knowing what's going on. And then Nusurpa, who said, "Yeshe Bar, if tomorrow or the next day someone were to ask all your disciples, 'What are you practicing as the core of quintessential instructions?' they would answer that it was to attain clairvoyance or a vision of their personal deity. However, they should answer, having become more and more certain about the cause and result of actions, we are practicing to guard purely whatever vows we have committed ourselves to. Therefore, an attainment of meditation refers to the affliction, such as ignorance, becoming weaker and weaker." So sometimes they talk about these cities or these wonderful attainments that you can have. You can get these clairvoyances and you can do all these wonderful things. And that's not really the attainment that we're looking for in our meditative practice. What we want to do is to diminish and eventually, get rid of the afflictions, as it says there, make them weaker and weaker. And recall also another great Kadampa Geshe, the Langri Tongpa, in the 8 verses. Recall that third one where he says, "Vigilant, the moment a delusion appears in my mind, endangering myself and others, I shall confront and avert it without delay." So even as a bodhisattva practice, this is what we're about. It's not like this is some lower practice. This is, our job is to be that vigilant, that attentive to what's going on. And that's the real attainment. If we've really developed our minds to that degree where we can see the afflictions arising, know exactly what we need to do to keep them from going any further, quelch them, as it was said earlier. Quelch, I don't use that word that often. All right. So it says, just as it has been said above, at all times during the actual sessions as well as the session breaks, again and again, examine your own mind and rely upon the antidote to whichever affliction has arisen. This is the principal training in virtue and the excellent essential point. Likewise, be mindful of the manner in which one must generate the corresponding modes on the various occasions of training in virtue, beginning with the virtue of faith and so forth on the occasion of the way to rely on a spiritual friend and so on. So again, this is where he's alluding to the Lam Rim, that we need to recognize that this is also a part of our training, is to continue to develop the virtues, the qualities of realization on the Lam Rim, starting from relying upon a spiritual friend, which is the very first topic, preliminary topic, perfect human rebirth, all the way through the topics of the person of small capacity, middling capacity, and great capacity. So he says, repeatedly rely upon mindfulness and introspection, and make every effort in the means to generate that which has not been generated, as well as to increase that which has already been generated. Right, yeah, our wonderful little dedication verse, as Rowena's pointing out, yeah. So this is really, again, the quintessential instruction, is that what we're intended to do is to be mindful of what's going on in our own minds, but also supplement it with this training in the Lam Rim that is really to strengthen all of what we're doing. If we get to a point where we've got that deep renunciation that we were speaking of earlier, then we'll be quite attentive to the mind, because we'll be quite convinced that there's no way we want the delusions to strengthen or become more prominent in our minds. Instead, we want to do the opposite, because we know that will lead to the result of renunciation. So there's a little verse here. Let's just read this first part together, the first, 4 kind of lines, and then we'll stop for a moment. Springing from the golden ground of pure renunciation, the tree trunk of the jeweled mind grows ever higher, spreading the shade of benefit and happiness for all migrating beings. At its tips, the far-reaching branches of the great vast deeds of the 6 perfections, while from the blossoms of the signs and exemplifications, drops of camphor of the 3 vehicles dispel the torment of fevered migrating beings without exception. May we always be nurtured by the wish-fulfilling tree, the Lord Muni, the sole sustenance for migrating beings as well as the gods. So this starts a little section that's kind of the closing verses that our author put together, Geshe Gelsen put together. And so this is a wonderful little analogy for kind of what we're involved in, all of the practice being from the golden ground of pure renunciation, this tree trunk of bodhicitta, the jeweled mind grows ever higher. So we need the ground of renunciation, as we've been pointing out. You can't have the tree planted there without that ground. It's essential to have that prior to bodhicitta. And then, of course, it spreads the shade of benefit and happiness for all migrating beings, because from our bodhicitta comes forth the practices of a bodhisattva, the 6 perfections, which are the far-reaching branches of the deeds of the bodhisattva, which continue, of course, into Buddhahood. All those deeds continue from the enlightened mind of the Buddha. And then from the blossoms of what are called here the signs and exemplifications, which are essentially meaning the bodies of a Buddha, 32 signs and the 80 exemplifications or minor signs, minor marks. Drops of camphor of the 3 vehicles dispel the torment of these fevered migrating beings. So again, those are the ways that the Buddhas are manifesting, is in these forms to help other beings by dispelling this soothing camphor that will, through the 3 vehicles that are taught. Again, the 3 vehicles are the 2 that are in the Hinayana, the individual vehicle, which are Shravakas, which are hearers, and our Pratyeka Buddhas, which are solitary realizers. They taught these. I don't know that you can discern, who's who. This is, again, just the way that it's all taught. And then there's the Bodhisattvas, the Mahayana. So those are the 3 vehicles. They're the ways that the Buddha taught to achieve either liberation or enlightenment. So that's how the torment of the fevered migrating beings is relieved, is by virtue of the Buddhas manifesting in these ways. And so then it says, may we always be nurtured by this wish-fulfilling tree. this path that allows us to become wish fulfilling for others. The Lord Muni, who is Buddha Shakyamuni himself, who is the founder of turning of the wheel of Dharma in this world, and then he's the sole sustenance for migrating beings as well as the gods. So anyway, don't need to make much more commentary on that. I'll say a few things on maybe the next couple of verses, but then when we get to the last few, I probably won't have much to say at all. But let's read this next verse. The supreme helmsman of scholars and adepts, renowned as the 6 ornaments and 2 supremes of Jambudvipa, donning many jewels that enhance the attitudes of the 3 vehicles, let fall a rain of benefit and happiness in the land of superiors, India. Okay, so in this verse, we're being reference to a couple of groups of people. The 6 ornaments are Nagarjuna, and then who's said to be one of his main spiritual sons, Aryadeva, wrote a text that's pretty well renowned called the 400 Stanzas, which was kind of reiterating what Nagarjuna had set out in some of his teachings on emptiness and so on. Then Asanga and Vasubandhu, whose names we know from this text in particular, because they both wrote texts on the Abhidharma, the treasury of knowledge, or manifest knowledge. There's Abhidharma Kosha and Abhidharma Samuchaya, and then the later one was written by Asanga, the earlier one by Vasubandhu. Then Asanga, as I mentioned earlier, also did quite a bit of exposition of a lot of the texts of Maitreya and mind-only tenets and what have you. And then the last 2, Dignaga and Dharmakirti, who you know from, they're the upholders of a lot of the teachings around logic and reasoning, and kind of what are behind some of what we're looking at, but also more the teachings around cognition and things like that, logic. So those are the 6 ornaments. The 2 excellent ones are supremes. You thought there were 3 supremes, right? Just joking. Anyway, some people someday won't get that joke. There were 2 supremes, and Jambudvipa means simply this world. Sometimes they refer to it as India, but it's usually just called this world that we live in currently. The 2 excellent ones are these guys that are known as Gunaprabha and Shakyaprabha. I didn't know who those guys were, so I had to look them up. And there was from some website, I found this little explanation. The 2 excellent ones refer to the 2 great Vinaya masters, Gunaprabha, who lived around the 9th century, and Shakyaprabha. And Gunaprabha was a disciple of Vasubandhu's and is most famous for his treatise, the Vinaya Sutra. Shakyaprabha was a disciple of Shantarakshita's. Remember, Shantarakshita was around, I think, the 7th century, because he went into Tibet. So it would have been earlier than Gunaprabha. And the other major teacher of Vinaya among the 17 great disciples, there's the 17 Pandits of Nalanda, these are a part of. So these 6 that I just mentioned, and then of course the 2 excellent ones are included in those 17. I have the list of the other 17, but I'm not going to go into those tonight anyway. It says he is particularly associated with the Mulla Sarvadevada Vinaya line, which has been followed in Tibet since the time of the early Dharma king Rinpochen. His teacher Shantarakshita began this ordination lineage in Tibet when he ordained the first 7 Tibetan monks and founded Samye Monastery. So anyway, that's kind of those 2 guys are being pointed out as being really central in helping the Vinaya to come to Tibet as well as to be well established in the world. So, kind of calling upon those guys, donning many jewels that enhance the attitudes of the 3 vehicles I mentioned earlier. We just want them to continue to let this rain of benefit and happiness fall. Let's do the next 2 verses, because I don't really have much to say about the next one. From the treasure mine of the Muni's scriptures, an abode difficult to travel to for those of inferior intellects who are tossed upon the waves of the varieties of the interpretable and definitive, bearing the exasperated expression of those unable to fathom the depths. The protector with the name of Mati Bhadra, out of the compassion of all the conquerors without exception, illuminated like the sun here in the north, all the texts setting forth the assertions of the great trailblazers. So that first verse that we just read, again, is seeming to refer to, again, the mind of the Muni scriptures, all the sutras and so on, that are an abode difficult to travel for those of inferior intellects. Makes sense. It is not always the easiest to navigate through all these various teachings of the Buddhas. Tossed upon the waves of the varieties of the interpretable and definitive. This is, of course, is the crux of all of our studies, is hermeneutics, is really understanding what are sutras that are meant to be interpreted versus those that are definitive, that we can rely upon in terms of really telling things how they are. And essentially in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, which is what we study and been going through here, the definitive are those teachings dealing with ultimate truth. So anything that is teaching emptiness, even portions of a sutra that are teaching emptiness. So you might have some sutras that they only teach emptiness in one part of it, like in the Golden Light Sutra. There's only one little section where he teaches on emptiness. That's meant to be definitive because it is teaching the lack of inherent existence of phenomena. But then any passage or sutra that is conventional in nature, that is not teaching ultimate truth, would be included in interpretive, because it has to be interpreted, just because even when we set out conventional truth, unless it's qualified as lacking inherent existence, it isn't really true. It's still just, at the level of conventionality, at the level of just mere imputation. So again, that's essentially how they define interpretable and definitive. And so, of course, if you have to navigate this whole sea of teachings without knowing what's interpreted, what needs to be interpreted, and what is actually definitive that you can rely upon for the wisdom realizing emptiness in particular, then it becomes quite difficult to fathom all of that. So then this interesting Mati Bhadra, the word Mati essentially means discernment or intelligence, and Bhadra means good. I could not find any being who's known as Mati Bhadra, but it has to be Tsongkhapa that they're talking about. I mean, I've never heard this as another name for Tsongkhapa, but Mati Bhadra makes sense. Good discrimination, good intelligence. I don't know, what's the Tibetan for good intelligence? Do you know? Do you have any idea? Rachel, sorry. I overestimate your knowledge of Tibetan sometimes.
I have no idea what that would.
Well, how that would, I don't think it's the translation of any of Tsongkhapa's names, though, I don't think. So I don't know where they came up with this Mati Bhadra, but it's a wonderful name. Anyway, he's good discrimination, good intelligence. So this protector, out of the compassion of all the conquerors without exception, illuminated all of these texts. It says here in the north, meaning here in Tibet, I assume, because this is a Tibetan writer of this text, Geshe Gelsen. So he's the one who illuminated all the texts that set forth the various assertions of the great trailblazers, meaning both Nagarjuna and Asanga, and of course Tsongkhapa, elaborated on both Nagarjuna's text and Asanga's text. So I think that's who's being referred to here, is Tsongkhapa. Let's read the next stanza.
And the great trailblazers?
Is Asanga and Nagarjuna. Yeah. Those are usually set out as the two, they're two of the six ornaments, but they're usually called the great trailblazers. They sometimes, call them charioteers, I think. Yeah. Let's read the next stanza then. Although this is the case, those ruthless ones, friends of demons, almost obscured by billowing clouds of ignorance, induced by the misfortunes of the 5 sediment degenerations, boast of their supremacy. Seeing this, my mind is ill at ease. So whatever time this guy was writing, Geshe Gelsen, he was saying it, even though you have this amazing Mati Bhadra, Tsongkhapa, just completely illuminating all of what the Buddha taught in terms of especially the teachings of Nagarjuna and Asanga that elaborated on various sutras of the Buddha. Even though this is the case, there are apparently these people out there who are a bit malevolent and saying that they've discerned different meanings or somehow come up with different interpretations that are superior, that are supreme. At this time of the 5 sediment degenerations, they call these the 5 dregs, rather than, I've never heard the sediment degenerations, it's kind of strange. They just mean that there are 5 degenerations that are occurring, not just, like some people when they hear this, they think, well, we live in a degenerate age. They think it means just like now compared to Tibet or, earlier on, or India 2,500 years ago. No, this is a degenerate age in terms of eons. So So the 5 degenerations are the degenerations that occur as human beings evolve over the eon of existence. Recall that there are, if you haven't studied the Buddhist cosmology, there are 4 eons. You have the eon of the empty eon, which is between the arising of a new system. Then you have the eon of arising, the eon of abiding, and the eon of destruction. And so this is how things go cyclically, is that you always are having these world systems come into existence and go out of existence. Well, during the eon of existence or abiding is when you have this degeneration going on. It starts off with, they say, human beings having these amazing lifespans and these magnificent bodies, and then they degenerate over time. So don't think about like the evolution on this world. Think about just how different world systems even have come into existence during this eon of existence and the diminishment of various things. At least this is how it's taught.
If you even look at ourselves, we don't exist, we come into existence,
Yeah.
we deteriorate and go out.
Yeah, you could, I guess you could use,
Embodying
yeah,
the entire
yeah. Tony was saying, yeah, you could use this model of the 4 things in terms of a human going through a particular, or a being going through a particular round of existence. So absolutely. So the 5 degenerations are degeneration of afflictions, meaning that the afflictions are so much more prominent that, as time goes on and the human beings in a particular eon of existence, they become more and more contaminated by afflictions. Of course, that's why they say the tantric teachings are really important during these times, is because you can use the energy of the afflictions, because there's so much of it, as a gateway to achieving, enlightenment much more quickly. The length of life, your lifespan, also is degenerating. That's the second one. There's also degeneration of time, which has to do with kind of the quality of crops and things, like over the duration of time that things don't have the robustness and capacity that they normally have. They wear out much more quickly and don't come to full fruition quite as easily. Degeneration of view, which means, of course, that beings they have more and more wrong views. And of course, that's part of reinforcing what we're seeing in this verse, is people who are propounding different views that they think are superior and supreme to what these great masters of the past did. And this is obviously a sign of that degeneration. And then the degeneration of the sentient beings themselves, meaning their physical form, their intellect, their health. As I said, their stature, I think they start off with an amazing stature of, I don't know how tall they are, how many, what was the word where they used it's kind of like a cubit, but it's another term. Yojong. Yeah, well, they have all these different, but I mean, the human beings, apparently, according to Buddhist cosmology, had these amazingly, huge bodies at some point. And we've just degenerated in terms of the size. There's not much potential. It's degenerate, so that we don't have the potential to have these large bodies anymore. Our size is much smaller. Our capacity is much less, all of these. So this is what we mean when we say degenerate times. Often we're not talking about just compared to 500 years ago or 100 years ago or 2,000 years ago. We're talking about over the duration of this eon of existence. Is that why people are getting sick from bad food? Well, it does say that. I mean, again, it has to do with when we look at time, the crops not being as robust or as healthy, or that even the things that sustain life are not as rich in terms of the capacity to do that. So yeah, this is what we're dealing with. This is where we are right now, is in this. Nonetheless, this is still part of what is often called a fortunate eon of 1,000 Buddhas appearing. So, and Shakyamuni Buddha was only the 4th. So we've got something going on in the midst of all of that, while it might be degenerating, nonetheless, we have some opportunity to meet with the Dharma. So this is just Yeshe Geltsen saying that in the midst of all this going on, this is what's happening, is people are putting forth false views. And we do have to be really discerning and make sure that we do rely upon qualified teachings and qualified masters that can expound the Dharma in ways that are true to the original meaning, to the intention of the Buddha. Lama Tsongkhapa's text called Essence of Eloquence is where he goes through all this interpretive and definitive and examines all the sutras that the mind-only school holds and that Svatantrika Madhyamaka holds and Prasangika Madhyamaka, and really helps to clarify all of that. It's an amazing text. I haven't studied all of it, but hope to someday. Let's read let's go ahead and read the next 4 verses, since we're getting close to the end of the course here, the class. I, owing to inferior merit, am born at the end of time, My eye of awareness is hazy and my training poor. Therefore, whatever I have failed to explain or have explained wrongly here, I confess to the wise. Their eye of awareness, polluted by unbearable dadura, their hearts agitated by the evil spirits of the 8 worldly concerns, even though they belittle me and are infuriated, I shall have nothing to do with them. By this virtue, may I and all migrating beings come under the care of the holy spiritual guides of the Supreme Vehicle and become holders of all the modes of the profound and extensive Dharma without exception, attaining the eloquence of self-reliance in regard to what is very difficult to fathom, in order to liberate all migrating beings without exception. May I become just like the Supreme Guru, Manjushri. So I found it interesting that one second verse almost seemed like it should be up above the other one, like referring to those folks who were propounding wrong teachings. You know, that their eye awareness is polluted by unbearable poison and their hearts agitated by the 8 worldly concerns. You know, I'll have nothing to do with them. Because the verse immediately before that is a bit of, kind of seems to flow after it. But so this is very common, though, that first verse that we read, for people at the end of the text to kind of take ownership of any faults that are in the text. I certainly take ownership of any faults I've had in giving commentary on this text. They're all mine, none to any of my teachers who've, you know, propounded their commentary on this to me. So again, this is just a way for our author to take responsibility for that side of it. And then, of course, the last 2 verses are really nice dedicatory verses, intending for the virtue that he's created through writing this text. And we can certainly think through our study of this text that we may come under the care of holy spiritual guides of the Mahayana, become holders of all the modes of the profound and extensive Dharma without exception, and so on. Become just like Manjushri. So the rest of this, I don't know that we need to read through it. It's kind of just a, you know, a little thing that's split, kind of a colophon of some sorts, explaining about the, I'll read it anyway, I guess. This necklace for those of clear awareness, clearly revealing the modes of minds and mental factors, is based on the root text and self-commentary of the Compendium of Knowledge, and adorned with the excellent explanations of the foremost father, Tsongkhapa, and his spiritual sons. It was composed by the idler Yeshe Gyaltsen, again very humble and saying, you know, he's just an idler, who was ordained at the door of the Conqueror's precious teachings and has heard a little on the modes of the Dharma due to the kindness of he whose name is uttered here most solemnly, Jetsun Tamche Khenpa Losang Yeshe Palsangpo, must be his root guru, and has obtained well the instructions on the stages of the path to enlightenment due to the kindness of both Jetse Lama Drupe Wangchuk Chenpo Losang Namgyal and Yongdzok Tenpa Ngadak Jetsun Jampa, at the repeated urging of many interested people, such as Kachen Losang Zangpo, a proponent of boundless sutra and tantra, at the Tashi Samtenling Hermitage on the border of Nepal and Tibet. Due to this virtue, may the precious Muni's teachings increase from every door. Then wonderful, my friend Ziggy To, who was in the master's program with me, translated this in 2003 when I was quite amazed. Some of the students in the master's program, after 7 years of study and even some retreat time, stayed on for the basic program. That was another 2.5 years of study. I was pretty much exhausted by then, so came back to the States. But Ziggy is an amazing student and practitioner. So, any final questions on this text or what we went through at the end here? Some nice little tidbits in there, but again, the main part of it obviously was our focus on the mental factors. So I hope that it's been of some use, and I'm grateful for Venerable Rabina for planting the seed of teaching this again here. You know, it took a while to get through it all. Didn't think it was going to take this long, but it's nice to do it in a way where we can really leisurely go through all of this. So Geshe-la will be here in 2 weeks. Next Wednesday there won't be class. In 2 weeks he'll begin teaching, I assume, on the middle length Lam Rim, wherever he left off, maybe doing some sort of preliminary to get back to where you guys were when he was here. And then when I return, I don't know what I'm going to teach on Wednesdays, but if there's any requests, I do take requests. I'm not sure I'll necessarily, we'll see what we do with them. Yes, Tony.
The Diamond Sutra.
The Diamond Sutra. I've never received commentary on the Diamond Sutra, the Vajrakuta Sutra. I don't know. I'd be a little reluctant to teach on it, and especially because, yeah, I don't know. But maybe we'll see. I'll take it under consideration, but
Yeah, so it's something in relation to that. No,
sure.
only because Diamond Sutra was brought up tonight. Only because Infinite was brought up tonight.
Uh-huh.
Only because the perfection of wisdom was brought up tonight. And I don't have any of the text.
Uh-huh.
You know, so I don't have any discussion, but I do have on my phone the Diamond Sutra, and this is chapter 13,
Mm-hmm.
and possibly ask the Bhagavan the name of this teacher,
Uh-huh. Yeah.
and the Buddha responds. The Buddha told the Venerable Subhuti, the name of the Islamic teaching, Subhuti, is the perfection of wisdom. Thus, you should remember it. And how so? Subhuti, what the Tathagata says is the perfection of wisdom. But the Tathagata says is no perfection of wisdom. Thus, it is called
The
the
perfection.
perfection.
Wonderful. So Tony was just reading a short passage in that version. The chaptered version is chapter 13. The one that we usually read doesn't have the chapter delineations, but it's about saying that what is a sutra to be called is to be called the perfection. It's the perfection is to be called the perfection of wisdom. Don't take it even as again inherently existent. Everything is simply called or labeled as such. Yeah, I think, and then Subhuti goes on to say something that this is the most incredible teaching he's never heard before. Cries and weeps, and so yeah. I mean, we'll figure out something. Again, in the basic program, I think I've taught all the courses. I have never taught Heart Sutra, but Geshe-la did Heart Sutra, so I mean, we've got that covered. But I've never taught the Tantra course. The problem is we have to have enough folks that have done highest yoga Tantra to be able to teach that one. So it'd be nice to do that at some point. But I think otherwise, most of the other courses I've taught. But there are three different kind of auxiliary subjects. One of which is the intermediate state, death and rebirth. That might be kind of interesting to do that. But we did 70 topics, and I think the third one is another tantric one. Yeah. So I don't know if we can do any of these tantric ones, and I'm a little reluctant to just keep repeating it, but nonetheless, because some of you in the room have been here for a number of the teachings we've already done, but if there are folks interested in it, it's always nice to do them again, but I don't know. You haven't been damaged by doing them. Well, good. I don't want to be inflicting damage on anyone. But yeah, we'll see what I do. We'll work that out, Rachel, and I'll figure something out maybe.
It's been very helpful because the introduction of the terms and perspectives the first time was quite a challenge. I wouldn't say it was totally difficult. You made it as clear as anybody could. But in the meantime,
Just not familiar.
stuff
Yeah.
that I understand considerably
Oh, good.
better. I mean,
Good.
language is the way to go.
Well, good. I'm glad you had that experience, Rowena. Rowena was just saying again that this time, having gone through it before, the first time was just getting familiar with the terminology and all the various things, and the second time kind of helps you to go a little bit deeper. Because there were a lot of questions that came up in the discussion of this time that I didn't even think of the first time. I mean, my own providing commentary on it. And again, as I've pointed out many times, a lot of the commentaries I have don't seem to address some of these deeper issues that do become a little quizzical. But
Geshe-la says, just because you've heard a teaching on this 472 times doesn't mean that the 473rd one is not going to be very, very important.
Okay.
He says something like that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, Amy was just pointing out that Geshe-la said, just because you've heard it 472 times doesn't mean you don't need to hear it the 473rd time. And it is true. We need to hear these teachings again and again and again. So anyway, let's go ahead and do our dedication prayers on page 235. Let's recite the first two as usual. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow. And may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Let's do verse 3 tonight. Just as the brave Manjushri and Samantabhadra too realize things as they are, I too dedicate all these merits in the best way, that I may follow their perfect example. Page 244, we'll do the two prayers there for the good health and long lives of His Holiness and Lama Zopa Rinpoche, but as usual, try to extend this out to all those beings who are in that role of being spiritual guides in whatever tradition. May they continue to abide in this world, and may we and others always have perfect guides in our lifetimes. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. All-powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain until samsara ends. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplished magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And as we usually do, let's dedicate for those that we're holding in our hearts right now. As Rowena was pointing out earlier, there's just so many things going on in our world, so many places of strife, difficulty, natural disasters, man-made events, violence. Think about those beings that we're holding in our hearts, but also those that we know directly who are experiencing obstacles or illness, who are dying or who have died recently in particular. And send this positive energy out to these beings, let it relieve their suffering immediately and bring them all the causes and conditions to find true peace and happiness. And may all beings find perfect happiness through our efforts here tonight. So thank you all so much for giving me the opportunity to teach this. I really learned a lot from my teaching too, so I appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you all online. You're very welcome.
So Dawn,